Welcome everyone to our GLP webinar, Prehistoric Land Use Reshaped Most of Terrestrial Nature. Does that matter now? That's the question we're going to be exploring together. My name is Ariane de Bremen. I'm the Executive Officer of GLP. For those of you who are new to the Global Land Program, we're an interdisciplinary community of science and practice, fostering the study of land systems and the co-designs of solutions for global sustainability. And we're really excited that you joined us today. Over 650 people registered for this webinar, and we are looking forward to a great conversation. So if you're joining us live for the event today, we'll start by going over just a few housekeeping rules, which I'm sure everyone knows well by now. But in terms of the recording, as you know, this webinar will be recorded. You're notified upon entry to the event that it's being recorded and had to confirm your participation. But we also wanted to let you know that your name and image will not appear on the recording unless you ask a question. If you're listening to the webinar recording of this event, welcome as well. All participants have been muted upon entry, and we ask that you please keep yourself muted during the entirety of the webinar. We'll be taking questions from the presenters via the chat box during the discussion portion of our time together. And that will be after our 4 speakers have spoken and our discussants have had a chance to share their questions. And if you can, then please submit your questions, and you can do that at any point via the chat, indicating to whom the question is addressed, if applicable. I guess lastly, please turn on your webcam if possible to make the event feel as much like a live event as possible. We could all use that right now. And if you have any technical questions, please submit your query via chat to our technical support or email at admin@glp.earth. And our team will be periodically posting contact information in the chat box in case you need to get in touch with us. So just to outline our webinar, over the next hour and a half, we'll be exploring the claims that prehistoric land use has shaped Earth ecology, that indigenous and traditional land use sustains biodiversity, and that global land use history matters more now than ever. We'll hear from Erle Ellis, Kees Klein Goldewijk, Jacquelyn Gill, and Delfin Ganapin. And afterwards, we'll turn to our discussants, our GLP Scientific Steering Committee co-chair, Navin Ramankutty, and our SSC members, Patrick Meyfroidt and Ruth DeFries. And they'll help us to begin our discussion with our presenters and with you, our audience, in answering your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Erle Ellis, Professor of Geography and Environmental Systems and the 2021 to 2024 Presidential Research Professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, USA. And so I will take it away, Erle. Pass it over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I thank the Global Land Program for organizing this, and it's wonderful to have a chance to talk about our work to such an ambitious group of early risers, at least here in the US. All right, so let's just get started with the basic concept that people are talking about, which is that land use is a threat, considered a threat by many, especially in the conservation community, to the future of the planet, but in specifics to global climate change, to biodiversity, and there is a feeling that this is a recent crisis, that land use is basically reshaping the planet in ways that are purely negative, that the clearing of forests, for example, is something novel and impactful only recently. But I think it's really important for us to take a deeper view of how people have been shaping the planet over the very long term. And even in Amazonia, here's an example of where deforestation has uncovered a very much deeper history of land use in areas that are often considered by many to be pristine and uninhabited places. We can actually find there's actually a much deeper shaping of nature, in this case, these geoglyphs here. But there's a reshaping of the biodiversity of the planet that has been sustained for thousands of years, even in regions that are described by many scientists as pristine, intact natural ecosystems. Look a bit deeper and you will uncover that these areas have biodiversity and plant communities, for example, reshaped by much earlier land use of different kinds. So what we set out to do with our project, and this was the paper in PNAS that was recently published, what we set out to do was to take the most up-to-date global assessment of land use around the world, land use and population, for the last 12,000 years, and look at what it tells us about human habitation and use of land over the long term. And we started this with, again, what is considered to be the mainstream and most widely used reconstruction of global land use history. And this is the HIDE 3.2 global assessment. And we have Kees Klein Goldewijk, who will present more in detail about this. But basically, that was our input, the starting point for our investigation. And then we wanted to use this through a landscape ecology approach, because land use doesn't act necessarily just where it is. It reshapes the entire landscape. So we needed to have a landscape scale assessment of how populations and land use are reshaping patterns like biodiversity. And so we rescaled the data from the HIDE data set, which is in a geographic projection. You can see at the top right there, these geographic global data systems produce these red, you can see in red there, the different sizes of spatial units across the planet. So we put everything into an equal area landscape unit with this kind of global soccer ball approach, the discrete global grids that divide the world up into equal area hexagons of about 100 square kilometers across the planet. And obviously, I'm going to have a quiz for you afterwards about how this works. But basically, we use a classification scheme that we've used and published before to take the land use and population data sets and move them into a form that basically combines the effects of population density and different forms of land use into anthromes, these different types of used inhabited mosaics of land use at the global scale. And so with this, we produce global maps of anthromes. And these range from the wildlands, which are basically areas that are defined as, within the data at least, having no human population and no land use. And then moving up from there to the cultured anthromes. These are anthromes that tend to have low population densities and low levels of land use, less than 20% of intensive land use. And then these other more intensively used anthromes going all the way up to urban anthromes. And we map these using the HIDE data set, which goes back 12,000 years at 60 time intervals. So it's from 10,000 BC to 2017. And we map them over time, and we produce these kind of charts and analyses that we're going to just go over quickly here that look at both the global spatial pattern and the global pattern, in this case, the pattern of change over time. And so we start with, of course, the very beginning, 10,000 BC, which is 12,000 years ago. And interestingly, if you look there, you will see that in this global data set, which represents essentially the mainstream Earth system knowledge of global land use right now, you will see those light green and light brown colors are cultured anthromes. So very lightly used, low population density, but inhabited landscapes. And that the wildlands there, without populations or land use, are only about a quarter of Earth's land, even 12,000 years ago. Okay, so that is starting off already very interesting. And that was maybe where we really got started looking at this. You go another 10,000 years into 1 CE, and that's about where you're starting to see these more intensive anthromes start to become a significant part of the biosphere. And you can see that the wildlands are decreasing a slight amount, but not that much. Mostly that kind of stays constant. You'll see that basically stays constant. Wildlands aren't a big part of the land use history of the planet. They kind of just sit there for most of that time. Let's go up to 1500, where we have the opening of the colonial, European colonial period, the colonization of the Americas and other regions. And what you see here is, if you look in the Americas, look here in Mesoamerica, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer there, but see the red in there. This is a very densely populated society there of the Maya in 1500. But look what happens in 1600. Okay, you see by 1600, that century, the great dying that occurred through the introduction of diseases and other colonial challenges to the local populations and the local societies, and just the general malaise of that period. We have lost a huge population and we have lost land use across the Americas. This is one reason perhaps why so many in the Americas still believe that there are all these pristine landscapes, even though if you were there 500 years ago, you would have seen something completely different. We zoom up to 1900, so just about 100 years ago, and you can see the planet looks a lot like it does now, highly transformed, but still look, most of the wildlands are about the same. It still hasn't changed that much. What's really changing is the intensification of land use in these areas that were already inhabited and used for thousands of years. So that's really the big picture here. It's not this picture of people rapidly moving into uninhabited areas for the last 12,000 years. It's quite the opposite. It's inhabited areas with people intensifying use in these areas, and also people moving into and transforming these areas into these more intensively used anthropes. And you can take a look for yourself. There's an interactive slider. You can look at this whole thing. You can zoom in on it if you go to this website. So it's a nice interactive system. And of course, you'll see all the problems with our data set, because no matter how up to date it is still full of errors that need to be corrected. So it's a work in progress, the global mapping of these things. But more important, let's get down to the concept of what effect did this long history of land use have? And what we're doing here is we're zooming into just those areas of the world that have been prioritized for discussions of conservation. Which areas are high priority conservation areas? And you can see for key biodiversity areas, which is one of the most high priority areas for conservation in the world, we see a pattern almost the same as the rest of the planet. Basically, most of those lands have been inhabited and used for thousands of years. They're not these pristine wild places. Even these areas that were identified as potentially natural in published work look about the same as the rest of the planet, used for most of the history of the last 12,000 years. We do have this likely natural class that does identify more of the wildland areas, but indigenous lands also have a long history of use. So these are areas with deep human histories. And maybe even more interesting, kind of surprising to us, is we did a kind of a statistical analysis to look at whether or not we could, with each time that we had a map of anthropes, so for all these 60 time intervals, we basically correlated the anthrome patterns of the world with global patterns of vertebrate species richness, so biodiversity patterns, and also these key biodiversity areas. And where you get these very bright colors, like the yellow colors, those are times when the global maps of anthromes are highly predictive or statistically associated very much with the patterns of biodiversity on the planet. And interestingly, you see the anthrome patterns of the past are more highly correlated with the patterns of biodiversity than even the ones of the present, especially in the areas of the world that are considered this mostly natural concept. So anthrome history is a better predictor of biodiversity than the current patterns of anthromes. So the history matters here. And there's something going on around 500 years ago. That's interesting. What was causing that? Well, the hypothesis under here is that actually the patterns of biodiversity on the planet are not just something that is natural, but is also sustained by human cultures. Cultural diversity is what sustains biodiversity. And for people who study this, it's quite well known that Amazonia is a mostly inhabited region where indigenous use of the landscape maintains the heterogeneity. It maintains the patterns of diversity in the landscape that sustain diversity of species. And some of the patterns of land use by, for example, indigenous people of Australia, their burning practices not only help sustain these populations, but also increases the levels of biodiversity in these landscapes, and has done so for thousands of years. And some of the most biodiverse areas remaining on this planet, for example, the high biodiversity megafauna assemblages of the Masai Mara are so named because of the Masai people who have basically, through their pastoral use of the land, have also maintained the most biodiverse assemblages of megafauna. So the idea that land use is inherently destructive of biodiversity is not supported by the evidence here. And we have thousands of years of land use behind this. Uninhabited wildlands just really aren't a big part of the story, either in the past or today. Wildlands have always been very rare. Current biodiversity is associated with past land use. So there is an association, and it is that land use actually is it could even be the cause of high biodiversity in a lot of regions. It certainly is related to sustaining biodiversity in these regions. The areas with high conservation priority are not places without people. These are places with a long history of human use of the land. And the high biodiversity of these areas is associated with the cultures of the people who have sustained these biodiversity patterns. Finally, it's clear that after thousands of years of long use by indigenous and traditional land users, we still have most of the biodiversity that really starts to accelerate in disappearing with the introduction of colonial societies and increasing intensification of landscape use. All right, and that's all I really wanted to present. I'm looking forward to questions and to hearing more from the rest of our speakers.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Erle. That's fantastic. And now I would like to introduce Kees Klein Goldewijk of Utrecht University and PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. He's going to be speaking about modeling prehistoric global land use. And Kees, go ahead and share your screen. And while he's getting ready, I just want to remind everyone, you can put your questions in the chat as we go. We'll be collecting those and trying to address as many as we can in the discussion section. Take it away, Kees.
Okay, thank you, Ariane. Yeah, my name is Kees Klein Goldewijk. I'm from Utrecht University, and I used to work for the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, PBL, but I quit working there from August 1st last year. So I'm now totally involved in Utrecht University. Yay. And I'm going to tell a little bit about the height database and what is it all about? What are the errors and the flaws in there? There are many, and how it come to that. So first of all, one of the main questions was looking at the current landscape. 1/3 is agriculture, 2/3 is more or less influenced, even more. And we came up talking to a lot of people, and also on behalf of a international review panel, which reviewed an integrated assessment model run at PBL, the image framework. And I told, like in the late 90s, if you look at the next 100 years, at least the model should be able to reproduce the past 100 years to show that you really understand the underlying processes. So I got the task to gather all the data necessary for it. And I soon found out that there weren't any spatial maps of population nor land use. So I decided to make them myself. And it was a start of kind of an epic journey, I would say, daunting at that time, and it still is. And it raises a lot of questions, especially from the start. Why does it matter at all, anthropogenic land cover and land use change? And what role does it play in the Earth climate system? It was one of the questions Image had, and we'll talk a little bit about the Ruddiman hypothesis. How do we study this? And that's why my own database comes into place. So what happened in the past? When did it happen? When does it leave us now? And what was the influence on the global environment, on the climate cycle, on the carbon cycle and climate? And what can we learn from it? And that's more looking to the future, but also relevant for this webinar. Does it really matter, this historical land use? And we like to think, yes, it does. So we had I think it was in the late 90s, together with Erle, we had a nice lunch with Bill Ruddiman at the one of the what was it called, a large conference in San Francisco. And he was telling that he had looked at the glacials and interglacial periods, and he compared a lot of them. And one of the interglacial periods was different than the other ones, and it was the Holocene, the interglacial period we are living now. From a natural trend, the methane and the CO2 concentrations should go down, but he found evidence in the ice cores that in this Holocene period, they go up. And his hypothesis was, okay, this is clearly a human phenomenon. Humans caused this because they started agriculture in the past. Around that time, they influenced our landscape, and they started practicing sedentary agriculture, growing rice, raising livestock. And he said this was causing this phenomenon. So I was very intrigued with that. We all were. And okay, after a while, I thought, okay, maybe we can answer this question where historical land use reconstructions. Why this is so relevant? This is just an example from another database, the KK10 data set of Jacquelyn et al. And one of my earlier versions, the high 3.1. And you can immediately see the difference that one of the first databases I got was very conservative, not very far back in time, a lot of agriculture activity, not a lot of people, and very minor influences, while Jed was very enthusiastic in his influence on the landscape. But there was already a huge difference in both estimates at that time. And it really does matter if you, for example, calculate emissions, carbon emissions, you get a huge difference in cumulative carbon emissions. And when you put that in a climate model, the result is very different indeed. So it really does matter what kind of historical land use you put in those models. These models are used for future policymaking, so we really would like to understand better the historical fate of land use and its relationship on the carbon cycle and climate in order to be more or decrease the uncertainty for future scenarios. So as I said, there are very few historical land use reconstructions on the globe. The first ones were either regional level or bookkeeping or just for cropland and for the past 300 years, but slowly a few, like I said, from Jed and myself, we went further back in time, we increased our resolution, we did spatially explicit stuff and added some indicators as well. But overall, the idea is, not surprisingly, population is a major driver of land cover change. The more people, the more pressure on the land, whether it is forest or other ecosystems. And the more people, the more agriculture, and the more pressure on lands, the more deforestation, etc., etc. And the idea is a little bit, which also I've started with, that, okay, in the deep past, there is a small area which is more intensive, which is used for a little bit of crops, fallow land, a bit of pasture, maybe hay, meadow, people live there, and a larger area around it for browsing, woodlot, etc. And there was a very modest influence on the landscape. Let me just here, okay. Extensive, intensive. And if you go over time, are some nice pictures from Jed presentations in the past. The amount of wildlands will decrease. It's slowly replaced and sometimes with extensive use of the landscape. And then it intensifies more and more and more. It's a classic Both-European model. People intensify, the production goes up, but there's still the influence on the surrounding landscape is increasing all the time until we have like more an American European landscape with all built up areas and some pasture and agricultural lands around it, and hardly any natural area left anymore. And we are very interested in how did it go into the past from 10,000 K BC until now, from the natural ecosystems, the frontier clearings, pastoralism, subsistence agriculture, shifting cultivation into more intensive and urban areas, etc. How did it happen? When in time did it happen? And where did it happen? So these are the basic questions about the high database. And I try to come up with these different stages of agriculture and trying to quantify it. I started with a regional version, which was just for 100 years on a regional level, and then slowly increased spatially 300 years on 5 arc minutes, which is like 85 square kilometers on the equator, and then finally over the whole Holocene. This version 3.2 includes cropland, but also irrigated, non-irrigated. I have rice, irrigated, non or rain-fed. We have intensive pasture and extensive rangelands, population, urban and rural, and also it calculates automatically the anthromes classification. There are future plans, but I will talk a little bit about that later on. Again, for height, very simple. Where people are, there is a chance of agriculture. It will not say there is agriculture, but there is at least a possibility of having some agriculture. If there are no people, there is no agriculture. So first I had to find good population data. And I took everything what I could find from historical statistics, libraries. Later on, I started in the mid-90s. Later on, there was much more to be found on the internet. Anything I could lay my hand on. But also I used some spatial information, satellite information, land scan, for example, for the present day. But you don't have to look at this scheme, but for now, the present day, we have the total numbers from United Nations, for example. Many people, where are they living? We have satellite information, so you can make the allocation. But if you go back in time, we don't have the numbers. We only have estimates, and we don't have the satellite information. So I came up with a very simple approach. I combined like, okay, what are good places in the past to have settlements? This is not on the polar or the Arctic regions or in the desert now. It's in a nice climate, probably closer to water than far away from water, fertile lands, not on the steep slope. I combined that and then allocated my people accordingly. So at the first glance, you get, okay, this is maybe reasonable, but if you zoom in, you will run into trouble. I go back to that. Basically the same. Yeah, first of all, I want to share you a little movie of population density, and I think this is also crucial for the whole anthrome approach. This is 10,000 BC, and you see already in the high database, people are already living almost everywhere in the world, but on a very low density indeed. It's not wild land, it is somehow semi-wild. But semi-wild doesn't mean that there will be people all over the place. No, probably in very low densities indeed, and not practicing agriculture per se. So that's something different. There are people, but not necessarily agriculture in this early stage. So if you run the movie, I can speed it up a little bit. You can see slowly emerging of people everywhere. There's the plague, and then here again a decrease in population. And if you speed it up a little bit, slowly, the encroachment of people and people densities all over the world as we seeing it now. So that's a major underlying data set of anthromes. Croplands is basically the same. How much was there in a certain time period, and where do I put it in a map? For the present day, because the image model at PBL uses FAO data, which has agricultural data of, for example, cropland and grazing land for every country in the world from 1960 onwards. I used national census data where I could find, but for a lot of countries, we didn't have any data at all. So we came up with just a per capita cropland, and we hindcasted this to 10,000 BC. Now, this is, of course, very uncertain, and I will say a few words about it later on. Where do I put it on a map? From the present day, we have the satellite maps for ESA CCI from 1992 onwards. But in the past, again, I don't have the satellite maps, so I come up with a combination of, okay, what are suitable areas for people to start agriculture, the neighborhood of water and rivers, on flat areas, not on slopes, on fertile regions, not too warm, not too cold. So I combined all these, and some areas pop out, like the Ganges regions in China, also in India, and also fertile areas in Europe. So at the first glance, it looked pretty okay. And it will yield maps like this. Just an example of, okay, how does it look like? You have some areas emerging from cropland, but also from grazing. There is no grazing until 1500 AD because the colonists, the European colonists, took over for the first time livestock and horses, etc. You get just maps like this. Yes.
You're at time, so if you could wrap it up in the next couple of minutes, that would be great. Thank you.
Anthromes is automatically computed I will not show this one. I see this green face. This is very uncertain. So the trajectory of per capita land use, we don't know how much this number should be in the past or how the trajectory is. And that makes a lot of, for the end result, it's very important. Applications, it's used all over the place. Also for this area, there is a land cover 6K working group from Pages, which are now in the process of improving my estimates with archaeological data, with paleoecological data from all kinds. We try to get a better estimate of the onset of agriculture and where it is and the magnitude of that. And I will skip the rest, but also this one. But take-home message, it provides historical population and land use. It's probably, I think, still too conservative in its estimates for the deep past, in magnitude and in timing. So it is uncertain, but I think if we have new evidence, it will probably not change the overall picture of past land use trajectories into the present. And I think that's relevant for this discussion. I'll leave it by this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kees. So interesting to hear about the evolution of this effort from the beginning. I know it's a lot to share. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jacquelyn Gill, Associate Professor of Paleoecology and Plant Ecology at the University of Maine, and she'll be speaking about prehistoric ecological change. Welcome, Jacquelyn.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I am calling in, folks are coming in from all over the world. I'm here in Maine, which is the historic and long-term homeland of the Penobscot Nation, who are still dealing with ongoing battles over land sovereignty and water rights. So they've been long-term stewards of the place that supports me and the work that I do. So just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that I am a white settler in a colonial nation. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of the Western perspective on some of these long-term stories about the relationships between people and nature. All of the people that I'm going to be talking about have their own knowledge bases, their own stories, and paleoecology and archaeology have not always been great about working in concert with the communities whose stories we tell, and that is fortunately changing for the better. But I did want to point out that there are other sources of knowledge that are really valid when we're trying to understand these long-term land uses. All right, so a lot of this, our understanding of these relationships really hinges on this fact that people have been in pretty much every part of the globe except Antarctica for at least 15,000 years. And this is a schematic that shows the migration of modern humans out of Africa. I should say that Homo sapiens were not the first hominins, the first humans to leave the continent. There's actually a deeper history of humans in terms of the natural world. In Eurasia, at least, and even parts of Southeast Asia, that goes back much longer than this. But in terms of our species, Homo sapiens, we migrated out of Africa somewhere around 150,000 years ago and relatively quickly spread to all corners of the globe. And there's increasing evidence that we've been in the Americas even older than 15,000 years. There's growing evidence that people have been here maybe 20,000 years or longer. And this is one of those really interesting places where Western science sometimes comes into conflict with traditional indigenous knowledges. Because if you often look where there is a discrepancy, this is a case where indigenous knowledge says humans have been in the Americas for longer than that. And just in the last few years, we've been revising our understanding of the arrival of people. So it's just a really good reminder that information is valid and something that we should pay attention to. But the point being here, one of the central points of this paper is that people have been largely everywhere, even the places that we think of as very remote, very pristine, and we'll come back to that. I only have 10 minutes for 150,000 years, so I'm going to go really quickly and kind of superficially through these, but I wanted to touch on the different types of land uses and really drive home this point that these were not a monolith. This is some work from one of my colleagues, Sam Munoz, and it really shows from archaeological data the distribution of different archaeological sites and settlements. You can see here we're only going back about 1,000 or so years ago, where in Eastern North America, you can see mapped out there are areas of high site density. Not coincidentally, they often follow rivers. and then areas of lower site density, and then areas where there are no sites at all. That doesn't mean that there weren't people there. The more people you have and the more densely and long-term people settle a place, the more likely you are to have an archaeological record that's left behind. And those are also going to be restricted to certain kinds of environments. It's not an accident. People settle along rivers, they're useful, but there are also issues where the records of those civilizations are more likely to be preserved in certain kinds of areas like wetlands or rivers. And so there's a little bit of you could get a little bit of a false image from this, that the places that are white on this map are places that have not been settled, and that's not necessarily the case. But really, there is a spatial distribution to the intensity of land use, and that's going to be true in any place. It's true today, right? If you were to take a flight and look down, you don't see intensive fingerprints of people everywhere that you fly. And so I just wanted to make that point, that there is a spatial heterogeneity to the long-term history of land use, just as there is in modern times. So when we think of the kinds of impacts that people might have played, or that we know that they played, and the relationships between people and their environment over time, one of the first that comes to mind is hunting or harvesting. And I wanted to take a little bit of time with this one because this is a topic that often comes up. It's also near and dear to my heart as someone who works on the end Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions. So we've essentially downsized or downgraded our biota. The end Pleistocene extinctions represents one of the reasons that the current warm period, our current interglacial, is so different from those previous interglacials. And that is that we are missing large populations of large-bodied animals, and specifically mammals. And so by about 10 to 12,000 years ago, we essentially, at least here in the Americas, where this extinction was the most severe, we lost over half of our species larger than an adult German Shepherd within just a relatively short span of time, geologically speaking, within a few thousand years. And as you can see from the schematic, we have the log mass for body size, so bigger to the right, smaller to the left, and just the number of species here for this bar graph. And you can see that not only did larger animals go extinct, but we lost the largest animals. So big mammals in particular are really at risk, or were really at risk for this extinction. And I don't want to downplay this because this had long-term consequences that are still playing out in our ecosystems today. But I would say, people often bring this up as a refutation of this idea that Indigenous peoples are stewards of their environments. And my response to that is that this is something that was global, right? This is a global pattern of extinction that everywhere that has experienced. It was less severe in Africa, a little bit less severe in Eurasia, but it is global. And it also represents a large-scale change during a period of extremely widespread environmental upheaval. We're coming out of deglaciation, and the introduction of people into places to compete with these large animals was probably always going to result in some pretty big cascading ecological changes. So, this is not something that we should neglect in terms of our understanding of these prehistoric relationships between people and nature. And it is a big event. But once this sort of occurred and essentially the biota adjusted into a new dynamic equilibrium, once people arrive in a place for the first time, and that's true anywhere, there are going to be ecological changes because we're a species, and that's going to be true anytime you have a species introduction. And this actually did happen again to a smaller extent on islands. If you look at the Pacific Islands, when people arrived by about 4,000 years ago, large, particularly flightless birds were much more likely to go extinct. And so we saw, there are some estimates that up to about 1,300 species went extinct in a more recent wave of island extinctions that extended not just in the Pacific, but also in parts of the Caribbean and elsewhere. So this process played out again, kind of on a smaller scale. And islands are unique, they're strange, they're weird, they're bounded environments. You can't have easy movement, on and off those islands. So they're kind of a strange example anyway, when it comes to just their ecology. But this whole process of people arrive and there's a disruption, there's extinction, that played out on islands kind of a little bit later as well. Fire is a big tool. That's one of the tools that we don't understand very well when it comes to the long-term record. It's really hard to pick up anthropogenic fire versus climate shifts in fire. It's a lot easier to do that on islands. And we do know that when people arrive, there's usually a big increase in fire activity. And then after about a millennium, there's a sort of new, like I said, a new dynamic equilibrium that arises. Here's a really interesting set of case studies from a paper that Jen Marlin and some of her colleagues put together, where you can see from a few different places. There's a lot of data on this graph. But we have, for example, here from the Pacific Northwest of what is now the US, there's two different examples where these little green triangles show the percentage of tree pollen. So it's a proxy for how covered the landscape is with trees. And then these red bars represent charcoal. So that's a proxy for fire activity on the landscape. And so here at Battleground Lake, you can see that there's not really a big shift, except when you get into European colonization, where there's a big increase in fire and a drop in tree cover, versus Lake Oswego in Oregon, where you see a big decline that happens. And this is associated with a cultural shift. So we have this case here where at some sites that are pretty close together, climate change remains the dominant driver of fire activity, but in other sites that are, maybe even adjacent to those, we see people take over as the dominant driver of climate or of fire activity. So sort of taking over from climate. And that happens variably across the globe. By about 2000 years ago, though, universally, people have largely taken over as the predominant driver of fire frequency, fire intensity, with some notable exceptions. But if you zoom out to the big picture, we sort of move from this really highly variable relationship between people and fire to essentially an intensification of fire activity. And that's true across the globe. Deforestation, which I'm using kind of as an umbrella term, people think of these large scale intensive examples like Rapa Nui or Easter Island. But it's also important to remember that in most cases, tree clearing is much more localized, much more variable, and much more short term, right? So Rapa Nui is interesting because it's an island. It's kind of a unique example, but this is not necessarily the case everywhere. For example,
Jacquelyn, just so you know, you're at time.
Oh, I am. Okay. Well, so yeah, trees, people don't cut them down everywhere. Agriculture and husbandry has varying degrees of intensification. So you can see this is the Aztec, this is, blueberry barrens here in Maine, very different scales in terms of intensification. Species introductions, this is something we largely don't know very much about when we're looking at the archaeological or paleoecological records. And so the big things I just really want to nail before I yield my time is that the pristine myth, this idea of colonizers arriving in a place that is untouched, is a colonial myth. It's a colonial artifact. And think about who benefits from that idea that a place is uninhabited, unused, right? And this is, for many parts of the world, our ecological baseline. It's the ecological baseline here in the US. It's the ecological baseline in many places, pre-European contact, right? And so this idea of erasing the relationships between people and nature is, it benefits colonial institutions, right? And so think about, it's not a neutral value, right? And so I just want to leave you with these 4 take-home points. One, that people have settled most regions of Earth since at least 12,000 years ago. That's a fact. We do see that initial settlement often drives extinction, but there's typically a new dynamic equilibrium that's reached, and that extends for many, many thousands of years. And that's true of that point of contact with colonial institutions. And importantly, prehistoric land use was not a monolith. And so you really need to understand, if you care about conservation, how were people using the land? How have they been using the land in the place that I'm interested in? Because that's going to differ very, greatly from place to place. And also, we do see a lot of evidence, which I didn't get a chance to go into, that Indigenous peoples have adapted through time to shifting environments, so major scale changes in climates and other kinds of environmental threats for millennia. And they have deep historical knowledges about their places. This is, we're just starting to recognize this when it comes to Indigenous fire management. That information is incredibly valuable. And so we need to be collaborating with those communities. Because we're essentially ignoring a lot of information about global change. And so with that, I will turn it back over to the organizers. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jacquelyn, for this presentation. These deeply valuable messages. And we'll have more time, I hope, in the discussion. Now I'd like to introduce Delfin Ganapin. He is the global leader of governance practice at the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF International, and he'll be speaking about Indigenous land use and conservation today.
Well, I'm going to share with you some of the findings of the Worldwide Fund for Nature mapping assessment that we did with the World Conservation Monitoring Center, as well as 14 other regional and global organizations that are involved in mapping land use by Indigenous peoples in traditional local communities. And our findings show that Indigenous and traditional local community lands that are owned, live in, or claimed by them covers at least 43.5 million square kilometers, which is 32% of the world's land. Now, this is considered an underestimate because there are many places where mapping has not yet been done, and actually also some groups do not want to share their maps because of some distrust on how these maps could be used. So this is definitely an underestimate, but about 30% or a third of the world are definitely considered Indigenous peoples and local community lands. Now, the finding from this mapping assessment show that Indigenous people and local community lands are relatively unmodified. 64% of these lands have low human modification and 20% with medium human modifications, which actually is one proof that Indigenous peoples and traditional local communities have actually quite succeeded in being good stewards of the lands and territories that they occupy. Note too that the findings of the assessment show that 36% of the most important biodiversity areas are actually in these IPLC lands, and half of these areas are outside existing protected and conserved areas. So there's lots out there that have no protection at all or no consideration for conservation by other institutions such as government. And the overlap is very significant. A lot of the important biodiversity which we should conserve are in these Indigenous peoples and local community lands. So the protected areas that we have right now do not contain all that we have to conserve. Many of those important biodiversity are outside existing conservation and protected areas. Now, we went into the question of why is it that Indigenous peoples and local communities have succeeded in conserving their biodiversity. And the study that we made was peer-reviewed with a lot of Indigenous peoples and traditional local communities. And from these discussions, we found the following concepts. Land use for Indigenous peoples is not just making use of the land, farming on them or grazing livestock on them, but much more than that. And there are basic foundation in terms of values that underline land use. Nature, for example, is considered in the Latin American Indigenous peoples as Pachamama, mother nature, and therefore you have to really respect nature. And in many areas, actually, you find that there may not be actual land use, but they are actually in use as spiritual, in terms of spiritual values, as sacred sites by Indigenous peoples and local communities. And so for the Indigenous peoples in traditional local communities, biodiversity is not just biodiversity, it's just part of their culture. So the way they refer to it is in terms of biocultural heritage. And this nature is the territories of life. Without nature, they won't survive. Indigenous peoples refer to nature as their pharmacy, as their bakery. This is where they get their food and livelihood. So these are territories of life. And so they're very careful in terms of the use of nature. Nature is used within limits. If you have looked at traditional shifting cultivation, there is long rotation of cultivation over these areas, and the farmer doesn't go back to the area until nature has again regenerated that area. And all of this are in terms of intergenerational sharing of knowledge, so that eventually there is wisdom of indigenous and traditional knowledge that adapts very well, that aligns very well to the ebb and flow of nature. And very important also is the collective values that the indigenous peoples and traditional communities have, so that we don't have this overexploitation of nature that comes from social inequity, where you have your desperate poor really overexploiting nature to be able to survive, and you have also the very wealthy that is overexploiting nature to gain more wealth. Now, the problem we face, however, is that there is future potential development pressure over these lands, and over 62% of the lands that we have looked at will face medium to high pressure in the future. Thus, we came up in discussions with the indigenous peoples and local communities, this categorization of the type of lands and communities that we have to work with. We have what we call the ideal communities, which has been able to maintain their culture and the traditional ways of working with nature. And we have also what we call desired communities. These are communities that want to go back to their traditional ways, into their traditional values, and opportunities are opened up by government in terms of policy so that they can restore and go back to their ways of working with nature. But increasingly, there is this category which we call disrupted, where actually mining, logging, industrial plantations, ranching, and the burning that goes with opening areas for industrial plantation and ranching has disrupted communities, displaced them. And so they have lost this strong link to nature. And even, religious groups coming in, changing the values have had an impact on disrupting communities. So this is the most important actually work that we have to do, dealing with disrupted communities and trying to restore their stewardship role with nature. So conservation now is not just about biodiversity. It's not about biology. It's now embedded in aspects of human rights issues. And the call of indigenous peoples and local communities actually is for the recognition of the rights to their lands and territories. It's now about equity and inclusion, having indigenous peoples to be part of policy making and governance, rather than just leaving it to government and very powerful lobbying by vested interests. And the concept of social justice also comes in, particularly in terms of restoration of many lands that have been taken away from indigenous peoples and local communities. And all of this is now being framed increasingly in the discussions on decolonization, where a lot of ideas about how we conserve actually comes from outside the countries and communities of indigenous peoples and traditional local communities. And very important in all of these discussions is the need for empowerment. Unless capacity is built, values are restored, and indigenous peoples and traditional local communities are given the power to balance with those that try to influence them in a negative way, then conservation will not succeed. So conservation right now is not just about nature, but people in nature. In WWF, in fact, that's what we call conservation now. It's about people in nature. And an important shift has to be done from the old fortress conservation, where we try to shoo away people, especially indigenous peoples and traditional communities, from what we call as wilderness areas or very important conservation areas, and instead get into what we call inclusive conservation, where in fact people become part of nature and becomes a steward and the ones that will protect and defend nature. Let me end my presentation by showing this slide that we developed with the Indigenous and Community Conserved Areas Consortium, when we said, well, how do we bring back or strengthen indigenous and community conserved areas. And I just want to highlight the 4 pillars that were there. Indigenous peoples and traditional communities said we need our rights and stewardship, which is about responsibility in the care of nature. They need to be recognized. And in that way, also need the strengthening of our traditional governance systems, rather than being imposed a certain governance from the outside. And underlying all of this, the strengthening of culture, because all of these are the ones that sustain their rights and their governance, and also sustainable economies, so that they can actually be able to survive and develop in their own agency and in their own way. So colleagues, that's my presentation and advocacy for actually recognizing rights of indigenous peoples as the way by which we can conserve and promote the defense of nature. So if you have further questions and additional info, there's my email there. We cannot answer all questions in this webinar, but we can actually answer through emails or exchanges later on. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Absolutely wonderful, Delfin. Thank you so much for bringing us to these critical present day questions. And I hope we can speak more about these 4 conditions that you mentioned in your last slide in our discussion. And so speaking of that discussion, we're now turning to the discussion portion of our session. We'll have about 25 minutes and I will introduce our 4 discussants. Well, I already told you who our 3 discussants are, but so it's Navin Ramankutty and Ruth DeFries and Patrick Meyfroidt will be leading our discussion, but we've been capturing questions from the audience. If you have more questions, please put them in the chat. We will try to get to them. We won't get to all of them today, but we will collate them for later. So without further ado, I will turn the mic over to Navin to ask our first question.
Thanks, Ariane. Good day to everyone from Vancouver. My first question goes to Erle, and this is a little bit technical and maybe nitpicky, but I feel it's an important question. I want to ask you about the kind of definition of human use in your analysis and its relationship to the scale of the observation units and the implications of those choices. So in particular, in your results, you can see that there are 2 classes like remote woodlands and inhabited drylands that are a substantial portion of cultured landscapes. And so it appears that any kind of non-zero human presence on the landscape makes a landscape cultured, and that the global area of cultured landscapes would be highly dependent on the scale of the analysis unit. So, if you take an absurd extreme at the global scale, if you had one analysis unit that was a global scale, the entire planet would be cultured. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you made these choices and the implications of those choices?
Great question, as usual, Navin. Thanks for that. And I would answer the simple answer for your question. Is the planet cultured? Yes. This is a used planet. Most of the planet is at this point is not used intensively or that extensively, but of course that's increasing all the time. But what is the definition of use in this study? That was one of the most interesting parts of the work, because we were working with this dream team, for me, of conservation scientists, ecologists, paleoecologists, archaeologists, all these different ways of understanding human transformation of ecology, human use. And in what it comes down to in this is really just that when people are on the landscape, they are shaping the ecology and they are using it in some way. Whether it's, as Delfin said, a sacred space in which food production is prohibited, that's still a kind of use. So when people are there, we consider that a used landscape. As for that issue of the units of analysis, like you said, the global scale, we have some use, so that means it's a cultured landscape globally. We chose this what's called a regional landscape scale by, for example, Reed Noss, who's a well-known conservation scientist. About 100 square kilometer units is a regional landscape, because this really is a landscape at which conservation effort really makes the most difference. Little tiny patches don't really, conserve a lot. And so it really does matter how people are shaping these larger landscapes. So that was our reason for our choice of units. So of course, it also matches up well with the scale of the data we actually have to work with. Hope that answers your question at least somewhat.
Yes, thanks, Earl. I think I'll pass it over to Patrick.
Yes, okay, you hear me well? Yes, okay. Well, so there's a lot of interesting question in the chat indeed, and just pointing to that one because I think it's a good follow-up because it's more on the methodological side. A question from Eric Lambin and others asked the same about spurious relation. Is it traditional land use that sustain biodiversity, or maybe people who traditionally settle in places where there's more biodiversity? So maybe if you can come to that, I think it might be interesting. But my question is more for Kees, because of course, well, what we see in your reconstruction is that, and of course it's clear that over much of history and prehistory and in most places, population density and affluence were much lower than they are today. And so intensification of land use and expansion of these intensive land use follow population density and affluence to a large extent. So the question is, to what extent is there a way to separate this relationship between impacts on the land and intensive land use and population numbers and affluence? And so that is more prospective questions, but maybe if you want to start by the more descriptive question of re-explaining a little bit how this relationship is represented in the HIDE database, and then follow up with that.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for this question. And that's not an easy one to answer. And it has to do with the population density on itself doesn't say anything about the intensity or the things people were doing with the environment. That really depends, I think, on the kind of activity they were doing. Like, was it hunting, gathering? Was it pastoralism? Was it shifting cultivation? Was it intensive, extensive? So for me, the sheer absolute number, so the population density, does not tell exactly what they were doing. So I think very low population numbers could be sometimes doing intensive things to the environment, but also the other way around. If the population density numbers were higher, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were doing very intensive stuff to the environment as well. At this moment, I really don't have this kind of information in the HIDE database. I'm hoping that the Land Cover 6K working group, they are now trying to map land use for the past, and they have this whole new category of level 1, level 2, or level 3, which they try to disentangle those different categories from archaeological evidence and other evidence, what people were doing at that time. And so I'm hoping that if they can say something about a certain time step in a certain region, that for me, it also reflects a little bit on the population density numbers, that maybe if there is a certain threshold, then we can assume that this kind of land use type B, C, or D was probably going on, and the other way around as well. But at this moment, I just look at the total number and assume a certain amount of agricultural activity, and that's it.
Thanks, very useful. Yeah, I can pass it on to the next question.
Shall I take that up, Ariel? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you to all of the presenters for this rich and insightful set of presentations. I'm going to follow up with Delfin and the comments that he made towards the end about governance, and particularly about the prevailing notion among conservationists that Indigenous and traditional peoples are, we can look to them to be stewards of biodiversity. So we know that, as you said, that Indigenous and traditional people in many places around the world do not have secure rights over their land and have been pushed into less productive and less marginal land. And it is a very politically fraught process to restore those rights. So given those realities, can we expect that the practices from the past that protected biodiversity that Erle talked about are applicable in today's world, and how we can expect that Indigenous and traditional peoples can be stewards of biodiversity in the land?
Thanks for that question. Actually, as I presented in one of the slides, we now have this category, what we call disrupted Indigenous peoples in traditional communities. And in fact, these are the communities that have lost their very strong positive link with nature, that cannot anymore implement their traditional wisdom and traditional practices in the management of nature. And they can actually, they are forced to actually be more destructive. And that's the problem we have. How do we bring them back to the traditional wisdom and ways of restoring nature and also working with nature? So the advocacy right now is very strongly for the rights, recognizing the rights and the governance systems of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Unfortunately, only about 11% have had this recognition. And even those countries which have policies to recognize them, it takes Indigenous peoples anywhere from 10 to 15 years to get the recognition. So it's a very difficult job. But actually, there's some movement right now. For example, in the upcoming global biodiversity framework, countries are now coalescing around the idea of 30 by 30, 30% of the earth to be conserved by 2030. In fact, some people are even saying half earth, 50% must be conserved. And if all states will go for that, that would be a good thing, but it's not enough. We have to make sure that the rights of Indigenous people in local communities, I have shown, which covers a lot of this 30% or 50% of the earth that should be conserved, has to be recognized. We have not found any other sector in the world that will defend with their life these conservation areas. And unfortunately, in many cases right now, the tension and the pressure to exploit these areas is so strong that you really need defense. You need restoration and defense, and Indigenous peoples and local communities are the ones who can do that, but they have to be empowered with their rights and their governance systems over these areas.
Thanks so much, Delfin.
Thank you.
And we're going to wander a little bit into different question areas. I'd love to go back to, so Patrick asked Kees about if it was possible to separate our relationship to the land from the numbers. And just as a follow-up to that, I'd like to ask Jacquelyn, are Indigenous and traditional peoples' land uses sustainable essentially because of those low population numbers? Hunter-gatherers and early farmers are known to have contributed to species extinctions in the past. And so we're wondering sort of what is the evidence that past Indigenous and traditional land use sustained biodiversity?
So I think that's a great question. And I think a lot of it has to do with the localized nature of some of those settlements. We had here in North America about 1,000 years ago, the city of Cahokia was larger than London at the time, right? And so we did have some limited cases of large scale or more urban or population dense locations. But we're just really now starting to understand what the long-term impacts of those settlements might have been. And there's pretty good evidence that, again, because those impacts were so localized and because people were so responsive to changes in their environment in terms of their subsistence or life ways. We often, for example, talk about the disappearance or the collapse of the Maya. And what we really, when you look at the archaeological record and the paleoecological record, deurbanization in those kinds of parts of the world is often associated with drought, right? Or large scale environmental changes. And historically, people have seen those kinds of shifts as a sign of a lack of resilience, but there's been a shift in anthropology and in archaeology towards seeing things like deurbanization not as a collapse narrative, which is something that we often frame them as, but rather a shift towards more resilience and sustainable practices associated with hard times, right? That being more flexible with your life ways actually is an advantage. And so, seen through a different lens, what we think of as sort of an overshoot or overshooting the carrying capacity of a landscape is actually something different, right? It's just changing your subsistence patterns or changing your population densities into more, or even your forms of government from less concentrated hierarchical to more distributed, actually gives you an advantage when times are changing. And so because of that, it's difficult to be able to make any kind of definitive statement about population per se. But increasingly, if we want to draw lessons from the past to the present, which I think is why we're here, in part, increasingly a lot of environmental scientists are moving away from the message that population is the problem. When you look globally, increases in or decreases in birth rate are actually associated with large increases in emissions and per capita footprints, both in terms of carbon or whatever metrics that you're using. And it's countries with large populations are often the ones, or high population growth rates are often the ones with the smallest footprints and the smallest relative contributions to historical emissions. And so I think we need to think beyond the simplistic idea that population is the problem and rather look on a case-by-case basis at the kinds of land uses that people, again, this is not a monolith, it's like the kinds of land uses that people are using in different kinds of places, because agriculture in a floodplain, in a grassland is going to look very different from adopting agriculture in a heavily forested region. And so, just as one throwaway example. So I think it's hard to make sweeping statements, and we should probably avoid them anyway, because we're not usually managing biodiversity at the scale of the globe, right, in practical terms. And so I think we need better data. We don't have great population data, but some new, these are estimates in these models, but some new emerging techniques, I think, both in terms of genetics, but also in terms of things like sediment proxies like fecal sterols and other paleo-environmental sources of data might help to shed light on some of those questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Jacquelyn. Navin?
Yeah, I want to come to a question that I think is in several people's minds, as I can see from the chat. And I'm posing this question to Erle, but Jacquelyn or one of the other authors of the paper can take it up too. The kind of main finding of your paper is that cultural diversity sustains biodiversity. And so Erle, Eric asks that you are very careful in noting that it's a correlation and not a causation. And so Eric asks, is it land use that promotes high biodiversity, or that farmers and hunter-gatherers who historically have occupied the most productive lands, which just happen to have high biodiversity areas? And Jerry asks a slightly different version, which is possibly that there is a common causal variable behind both biodiversity and cultural diversity, say favorable biophysical conditions, where we happen to have both humans and biodiversity.
Well, thanks. Yeah, great question. And as Eric recognized, this study is really not able to answer that question, because it is only correlating. It's showing that empirically there is a very strong relationship between land use history and biodiversity. And it could come from people literally using land in the most biodiverse areas, not because the use of land produced very biodiverse areas. That is true. However, and that was why we worked with this dream team of archaeologists and paleoecologists and conservation scientists, there is a lot of knowledge out there on this subject. And if you work with archaeologists who study these patterns, that's what you find, is that you do see people are shaping the landscape in ways that actually enhance and increase biodiversity. Very homogeneous place can be made much more biodiverse by a diverse mosaic type of use of the landscape. And that's what you basically see with indigenous people. They also move species around. And so there's a lot of tending of nature by indigenous societies that does produce these kinds of patterns. Now, whether all of it is explained by that. I don't think so. I think there are, like Jerry said, there's a lot of different correlates going on here. But the part that is just not recognized properly by ecologists and conservation scientists in general, there's plenty of people who recognize this, is that people actually do enhance and sustain biodiversity. That's not part of the paradigm for a lot of the people that really need to understand that. So I think that's an important part of the story that is often being left out. And I hope that our study helps people look at that data better. And it is getting better and better, as Jacquelyn noted, with the new techniques.
Yeah, I would just reiterate what Erle said, that, one, people are probably more drawn to places that are biodiverse because of resources. That makes sense. But also there is a lot of evidence, whether we're talking about beneficial palms in the Amazon or, other examples where people are actually, or the prairie forest ecotone sort of as a shifting mosaic of different patches, those are examples where stewardship or just land use, whatever terms we want to use, is actually increasing diversity. And I would say that as a side note, this also, I think, forces us to, when we face these global problems, it's very attractive to try to find these simple metrics and these simple sort of binary frameworks that explain or will protect or solve the problems that we've caused. But I think it challenges us to think beyond some of the metrics that we use to even characterize these problems. For example, something like species richness might seem like a really good metric or useful metric to try to, at least at the regional or global scale, assess what our impacts are. So just how many species do we have in a place? But there was a recent paper by Maria Dornelis and Brian McGill and a bunch of other folks that found that if you just look at richness, just the number of species that we have, which is often what we mean when we say biodiversity, we have actually not seen a net decline if you look region by region, because local extinctions are being replaced with species introductions. And so from just that flat number of richness, you would think that nothing's going on. Now, the picture is obviously more complex than that. We don't want species to go extinct for all kinds of reasons, even if they are replaced by other species or species invasions. But I think what it challenges us to do is to think about what are the useful conservation metrics and management metrics for our questions, for our place, for our problems at the source. And this is me as a geographer coming out, obviously, very place-based. But just thinking about biodiversity or richness per se is sometimes going to lead us astray in ways that we may not have expected.
Great, thank you, Jacquelyn. Patrick.
Yes, okay. So maybe it's a question for Delfin, but I think others can also jump in to respond. It's just if you want to return a little bit on the relations or the implications of the finding of this study for conservation programs and projects like 30 by 30 or Alfred, and the interactions between these kinds of conservation programs and indigenous land use. And I would like to mix this question a little bit with one question that was in the chat from Leonid, who wanted to ask this question with the perspective also, for example, of different contexts. And she was raising the situation of European mountain regions where the traditional land uses are pastoralist land use, and where there are really important conflicts between these traditional pastoral land uses and the conservation agendas of rewilding, for example, with reintroduction of predators like wolves. So, well, do you think that the perspective from indigenous people and conservation agenda working hand in hand are necessarily the same across all kinds of contexts? Maybe that's a question.
Well, perhaps I'll provide some answers from the perspective from our discussions with indigenous peoples on this one. Actually, when we learned about the study, this study we felt was one very important policy paper or a way by which we can advocate rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And the reason for that is that we still have many governments that see a lot of these areas for conservation as a wilderness in the traditional term, that there's no people there. And in fact, the reason why we're also helping a lot of indigenous peoples and local communities to do mapping is that they say that unless they map these areas, ensure that these areas have been occupied by them for generations, and even areas where there's no sign of use are actually occupied in the spiritual sense, then they become invisible. And so the government says, okay, well, there's no one there, let's put a fence around it. And that is now what we call fortress conservation. Now, by showing that, in fact, these areas have been occupied, they've been used, and the fact that these areas are still very, very good in terms of biological or biodiversity integrity, is in fact a reason why the presence of indigenous peoples and traditional local communities over these areas have actually been good for these areas, not only in terms of the management of these areas, but the defense of these areas. One thing that I forgot to mention in my answer to the question of Ruth is that from indigenous peoples and traditional communities' wisdom, we actually find good ways by which we can restore nature. There are many practices and technologies that are now being found to be the way by which, even in our modern way, we can actually make use of nature and manage nature. And this study shows that, in fact, for thousands of years, people have worked with nature and therefore have developed good wisdom in how to work with nature in ways that will not destroy it. So, from the conservation point of view, the paper is quite an important one for the policymakers.
That's a fantastic closing thought from Delfin. And on that note, what I'm going to do is ask each of our other presenters, starting with Erle and then Kees and then Jacquelyn, to just give us a quick closing thought before we wrap it up.
All right. Well, again, I'd like to thank everybody for participating, but most importantly, I would like to emphasize what we accomplished here, which really impresses me, is that we've managed to get very different perspectives, people who really don't normally work together to talk about one of the most important issues of our time, which is how are we going to shape the nature of the future, and realizing that the way that people shape nature isn't always a negative thing, that the traditions of the past have a great deal to offer in conservation. We can't keep people out of nature. So how do we have better relationships? And I think we have a lot to learn from people who have done this, at least within their cultures, for thousands of years. So we have a lot to learn. And I think we have a lot to learn from each other. And I'd like to thank Global Land Program for bringing these different networks, these different social networks of knowledge together to address this. Thank you.
Thanks, Erle. Kees?
Yeah, I just want to thank you also, GLP, but also as a reminder, this is based on ongoing work. We are just scratched the surface as far as I'm concerned. So I like to ask people if they know of any data set of land use or population fluctuations in the past, whatever new technique you're using, please contact me, because I think there is much room for progress. So don't think this database is fixed and solid. No, it's work in progress. So we are still working on it. And I'm, as Erle said, very excited to work with other disciplines to make the puzzle of the past. So thank you.
Thanks, Kees. Jacquelyn?
Yeah, I want to say that, we're hoping that this is the start of a conversation and not the end. And that if nothing else, this work is ongoing, but we really hope that this opens up new avenues for transdisciplinary collaboration, but also to encourage us to ask better questions and to challenge the assumptions that we've taken for granted as we approach restoration targets and the kinds of stakeholders that we're inviting to the table. So if this causes you to think about that even just a little bit and to expand your tent, both in terms of your questions, your knowledge base, and your collaborators, then I will be very happy.
Thanks so much, Jacquelyn. Great. So I just wanted to say again, just on behalf of GLP, thanks for everyone for attending, and to our presenters and to our discussants, especially some of them that got up super early in the morning to be here. As diverse as the paper, we have this diverse audience here that's come together. If you want to stay in touch with GLP, consider becoming a member, and all the information is there on the website. So thank you so much for being here, and have a great rest of your day.